At 43, Hannah Brooks had already lost everything that made her feel respected. A public scandal turned her into the woman everyone whispered about. Her accounting business collapsed. Her husband walked away. Lifelong friends stopped answering her calls, and every trip through town came with lowered voices and judging eyes. With only $75 left in her wallet, she made a decision so unbelievable that people laughed out loud. She spent every last dollar buying an abandoned saddle shop that had been sitting empty for years, a place everyone else considered nothing more than a rotting building waiting to be demolished. The auctioneer shook his head. The crowd smirked, and someone even joked that she'd finally found a place that matched her ruined reputation. But 3 weeks later, while clearing decades of dust from an old workbench, Hannah discovered a hidden compartment no one had opened in generations. Inside was a weathered leather ledger stamped with 2 unfamiliar words: Rancher's Registry. She turned the first page, and what she saw would uncover a forgotten legacy that could change not only her own life, but the history of an entire ranching community. Before we reveal what was written inside that mysterious registry, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now. Leave a comment below so I can say hello. And if you're just discovering this channel, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss more heartfelt stories like this. Wherever you are, I hope you're having a wonderful day, and now, let's begin Hannah's incredible journey. The folding chairs in the town hall were filled long before the meeting officially began. Yet Hannah Brooks had never felt more alone. Conversations that usually blended into harmless background noise stopped the moment she stepped through the doorway. Faces she had known for decades turned away, while others watched openly without bothering to hide their curiosity. She recognized nearly everyone in the room: former clients, neighbors, parents whose taxes she had prepared every spring. People who had once trusted her enough to leave house keys on her office desk while they rushed to work. Now they looked at her as though she had become someone else overnight. The council chairman cleared his throat and adjusted a stack of papers before speaking into the microphone. As most of you know, the Community Harvest Fund is facing a serious financial discrepancy. The words echoed through the room with painful clarity. Hannah closed her eyes for a moment. She had heard the accusation so many times during the past 3 weeks that every sentence felt rehearsed. Missing money, falsified records, mismanaged accounts. No formal charges had been filed, but the damage had already been done. Rumors moved faster than facts in a town this small. By the time investigators announced they were still reviewing documents, nearly everyone had decided the case for themselves. Someone in the back whispered loudly enough to be heard, "She fooled us all." A few quiet laughs followed. Hannah lowered her eyes. She wanted to defend herself. She wanted to remind them that she had volunteered hundreds of hours organizing charity drives, balancing non-profit books without charging a cent, helping struggling ranch families file paperwork they could never understand alone. Instead, she remained silent. Every attempt to explain had only convinced people she was making excuses. After the meeting ended, no one approached her except to move around her on the way to the exit. Outside, the afternoon sun felt strangely cold. Her phone remained silent. Her office windows had already been emptied earlier that week after every remaining client canceled their appointments. Even the handwritten sign reading Brooks Accounting had been taken down. It lay face down in the trunk of her aging pickup truck beside 2 cardboard boxes containing framed certificates, office supplies, and family photographs she no longer wanted to look at. The house felt even quieter. Half the closet stood empty where her husband, Mark, had packed his clothes 2 days earlier. He had not shouted when he left. That somehow hurt more. He simply said he couldn't keep living beneath the weight of everyone's judgment. "Maybe things will become clearer later," he had said while carrying the last suitcase through the front door. Hannah had wanted him to stay long enough to see the truth come out. Instead, she watched his truck disappear around the corner without looking back. She spent the evening sorting through unpaid bills. The numbers refused to cooperate. Mortgage payments, utilities, insurance. There was no possible way to keep everything afloat without work. After paying what little she still could, exactly $75 remained inside her worn leather wallet. She counted it twice, hoping she had missed a bill or forgotten a few folded notes tucked into another pocket. Nothing changed. The next morning, she loaded the last of her belongings into the pickup. Her original plan was simple: leave town, find temporary work somewhere nobody recognized her name, rent a room until investigators finally uncovered the truth. If they ever did. Before reaching the highway, she noticed a weathered sign planted beside the county road. Public auction today. The list beneath included old farm equipment, unused storage sheds, and one final item that caught her attention almost by accident. Harper Saddle Shop. She remembered the building from childhood. Her father had once pointed toward it while driving through town, saying the finest saddles in 3 counties had been made there long before Hannah was born. The place had been abandoned for years, windows boarded, roof sagging. Everyone assumed it would eventually collapse on its own. Curiosity pulled her into the auction yard. Fewer than 30 people gathered beneath the bright sky. Most had come for tractors and fencing supplies. Hardly anyone glanced toward the neglected wooden building standing beyond the equipment. The auctioneer. Owen Carter recognized Hannah immediately. His expression carried sympathy rather than suspicion, something she had not seen in weeks. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said quietly. "Just passing through," Hannah answered. The auction moved quickly. Tractors sold, wagons sold, old machinery found buyers. Finally, Owen unfolded one last sheet of paper. "Harper Saddle Shop," he announced. Silence answered him. Someone chuckled. Another man shrugged. "Nobody wants that place," Owen asked again. Still nothing. Hannah stared at the faded storefront. It was worthless. Even the land beneath it had little value after years of neglect. Yet something about the empty doorway reminded her of herself. Forgotten. Judged before anyone looked inside. Before she could reconsider, her hand lifted. $75. Every head turned toward her. A burst of laughter rolled across the crowd. "That's every penny she's got," one voice joked. "Perfect place to hide after stealing charity money," another muttered. Hannah ignored them. Owen looked directly at her for several long seconds before striking the wooden gavel. Sold. The laughter slowly faded as paperwork changed hands. Owen folded the receipt and placed an old iron key into Hannah's palm. His weathered eyes lingered on the building before returning to her. "People only remember how that place ended," he said softly. "Sometimes that's the smallest part of a story." Hannah frowned. "What do you mean?" Owen offered only the faintest smile. Maybe it was waiting for the right person, with the key clenched tightly in her hand. Hannah crossed the cracked sidewalk toward the abandoned saddle shop. Dust coated the windows so heavily she could barely see inside. The lock resisted before finally turning with a sharp, metallic click. The heavy wooden door groaned open, releasing the scent of old leather, cedar, and decades of silence. Sunlight spilled across a forgotten workbench where a single handmade saddle rested beneath a thick gray blanket of dust, and just beneath it, almost hidden from view, she noticed the edge of a small drawer secured by a rusted brass lock. Morning light filtered through the dusty front windows, revealing just how much neglect the old saddle shop had endured. Every shelf carried a blanket of gray dust, Cobwebs stretched between wooden beams, and scraps of dried leather lay scattered across the floor, as though someone had simply walked away in the middle of a day's work decades earlier. Hannah stood quietly inside the doorway, still holding the iron key Owen Carter had handed her the previous afternoon. The building was certainly worth no more than the $75 she had paid for it, or so everyone in town believed. Yet after everything she had lost, having a place that belonged to no one else felt strangely comforting. She set her 2 cardboard boxes beside the wall and began opening windows one by one. Most resisted before finally giving way with loud groans. Fresh air pushed years of stale dust into the sunlight. She found an old broom leaning behind the counter and swept a narrow path through the debris, coughing every few minutes as clouds of dust floated around her. The work was exhausting, but it gave her something she had not enjoyed in weeks, a problem she could solve, one step at a time. By noon, she had uncovered most of the main workbench. The handmade saddle resting on top was beautifully crafted despite its age. The leather had dried and cracked, yet every stitch remained remarkably straight. Whoever built it had cared deeply about the work. Hannah gently brushed away another layer of dust and noticed faded initials pressed into the underside. H.S. She assumed they belonged to the original owner of Harper's Saddle Shop. She smiled faintly. For the first time since the scandal began, she found herself thinking about someone else's story instead of her own. A truck slowed outside before stopping near the entrance. Hannah looked up, expecting another curious neighbor. Instead, a young woman stepped out carrying a weathered veterinary bag. She wore dusty jeans, worn boots, and a friendly expression that seemed refreshingly free of judgment. "Sorry," the woman called as she approached the doorway. "I thought this place was still abandoned." "Not anymore," Hannah answered. "I bought it yesterday." The woman looked surprised before extending her hand. "Ellie Morgan. I'm the local veterinarian." Hannah hesitated only briefly before shaking it. Hannah Brooks. Recognition crossed Ellie's face, but it was followed not by suspicion, only quiet understanding. "I've heard your name," she admitted gently. Hannah laughed without humor. "Most people have." Ellie glanced around the room. "Actually, I came because one of my clients mentioned seeing someone opening the shop. I wondered if there might still be old saddle repair tools inside. Some ranchers keep asking whether anyone around here still repairs tack." Hannah looked across the cluttered workshop. "If there are tools, I haven't found them yet." Ellie stepped inside and carefully examined the workbench. "This place has good bones," she said. "It would be a shame to lose it." The simple remark caught Hannah off guard. Nearly everyone else had spoken of the building as if it were already beyond saving. They spent the next hour clearing shelves together. Ellie moved naturally through the workshop, recognizing tools Hannah had never seen before. She explained the purpose of stitching awls, edge bevelers, heavy punches, and leather knives. Listening gave Hannah's mind a welcome rest from thoughts of court hearings, missing records, and whispered accusations. Behind one cabinet, they discovered several framed photographs covered in grime. Hannah carefully wiped the glass with an old cloth. The largest photograph showed 5 smiling men standing in front of the shop many years earlier. Each held a finished saddle. Another picture showed horses tied outside while ranch families gathered nearby. Business here had once been thriving. "That's remarkable," Ellie said. "I've never seen these before." Hannah turned over one frame. Written neatly on the back was a simple note. "Harper Saddle Shop, Spring Gathering. Thank you, friends." There were no last names, only gratitude. As the afternoon wore on, Ellie prepared to leave for another farm visit. "If you need another pair of hands, let me know," she said. "People deserve at least one fresh start." Hannah watched the truck disappear down the road before returning to the workbench. Her attention drifted once again toward the small, brass-locked drawer beneath it. She examined the lock carefully. Age had darkened the metal, but it remained solid. She searched every shelf, every cabinet, every old tin box she uncovered. Dozens of loose nails, bent hinges, rusted screws. No key. Remembering how craftsmen often hid spare tools close to their benches, she inspected the work surface more carefully. Several hammers hung from pegs nearby. One in particular felt unusually heavy. The wooden handle had been polished smooth by years of use. Curious, Hannah twisted the metal cap at its base. At first, it refused to move. She wrapped it in a cloth for better grip and tried again. This time, the cap loosened with a quiet crack. Something metallic slid gently into her hand. A tiny brass key. Her pulse quickened. She stared at it for several seconds before kneeling beside the workbench. The key fit perfectly into the old lock. For a moment, she hesitated, almost afraid that opening the drawer would reveal nothing more than forgotten nails or worn receipts. She slowly turned the key. The lock clicked. The drawer slid open with surprising ease. Inside lay only 3 objects: a folded cleaning cloth, a small black and white photograph of the same workshop filled with smiling ranchers, and beneath them, wrapped carefully in cracked brown leather, rested a thick ledger unlike any bookkeeping record Hannah had ever seen. She lifted it gently. The leather cover carried deep embossed letters that remained perfectly clear despite their age. Ranchers' Registry. She opened the first page expecting financial accounts, but instead found neat handwritten names arranged one beneath another, each followed by unfamiliar symbols instead of numbers. There were no explanations, no dates beyond occasional years, only names and mysterious marks filling page after page. Hannah frowned as she turned another sheet, then another, near the middle of the book. One name stopped her hand instantly. Walt Mercer. She recognized it immediately. Walt Mercer was still alive. The elderly rancher lived alone on one of the oldest cattle properties outside town. Hannah looked back at the cover of the ledger, then once more at the familiar name. Whatever this registry meant, someone who might know its purpose was still living. The next morning, Hannah wrapped the weathered ledger in a clean towel before placing it carefully on the passenger seat of her pickup. She had spent half the night reading the same pages over and over, hoping the unfamiliar symbols would somehow begin to make sense. They never did. Only one thing remained clear. Of all the names filling the rancher's registry, only one belonged to someone she knew was still alive: Walt Mercer. If the book had survived hidden inside Harper's saddle shop for decades, perhaps he could explain why. The Mercer Ranch sat nearly 40 minutes outside town, where the paved road gave way to gravel and wide stretches of pasture. The ranch itself showed every sign of age but none of neglect. The fences had been repaired many times instead of replaced. The barn wore faded red paint, yet the roof looked solid. Everything suggested someone who believed in preserving what still had purpose. Hannah parked beside a weathered windmill. Before she reached the porch, an old shepherd dog wandered toward her, sniffed her boots, then settled beside the steps with a slow wag of its tail. "Looks like Rusty approves of you," an older voice called. Walt Mercer emerged from the barn carrying a bucket of feed. His movements were slower than they probably had been years ago, but they were steady. Deep lines crossed his face, and his hands bore the unmistakable marks of a lifetime spent working leather, rope, and cattle. "Morning," Hannah said. "I'm sorry to arrive unannounced." Walt set the bucket down. "Most folks who come this far have a reason." She hesitated before unwrapping the ledger. "I hoped you might recognize this." The moment his eyes fell on the leather cover, his expression changed completely. His shoulders stiffened. The warmth left his face.
replaced not by fear, but by quiet disbelief. He stepped closer without saying a word. For several long seconds, he simply stared at the embossed title, Rancher's Registry. "Where did you get it?" he finally asked, his voice barely louder than a whisper. "Inside Harper's saddle shop," Hannah answered. "It was locked in a drawer beneath the workbench." Walt removed his hat slowly. "I never thought I'd see this again." He motioned toward 2 wooden chairs on the porch. "Sit with me." They settled into the shade while Rusty stretched out nearby. Walt accepted the ledger with surprising care, as though he feared the worn leather might crumble beneath his fingers. He brushed away a little dust before opening the first page. The familiar rows of names appeared exactly as Hannah had found them. His eyes stopped almost immediately at his own entry. A gentle smile crossed his weathered face. "Harper always wrote neatly," he murmured. "Said a person's name deserved respect." Hannah leaned forward. "I've been trying to understand what this book is. It doesn't look like business records." Walt chuckled softly. "That's because it never was." He tapped the page beside his own name. "See this mark?" Hannah nodded. "I hoped you'd tell me what it means." "When I was 24, Walt began. My best saddle finally gave out during calving season. I couldn't afford another one. My cattle needed moving, and the bank had already refused another loan. I walked into Harper's shop expecting him to patch the old saddle together one more time." Walt smiled at the memory. "Instead, he measured my horse, spent 3 evenings building a new saddle, and handed it to me without asking for payment." Hannah frowned. "He gave it away?" "Not exactly." Walt looked down at the ledger. "He said every person falls behind at some point. What mattered was whether they stood back up." He pointed to the small symbol beside his name. This mark meant a complete saddle, no charge. Hannah studied the tiny handwritten mark again. The symbol had seemed meaningless only hours earlier. Now it represented an act of quiet generosity. "Did everyone in this book receive free saddles?" she asked. Walt shook his head. "No. Harper helped people in different ways. Sometimes it was repairing harnesses, sometimes replacing worn leather, sometimes lending tools. Whatever kept a ranch running until better days returned." Hannah slowly turned another page. More names, more symbols. Still no dollar amounts, no balances, no signatures promising repayment. "Then why record any of it?" she asked. Walt closed the ledger halfway before answering. "Because Harper believed kindness should be remembered even when money wasn't." He smiled faintly. He never wanted anyone embarrassed. The book stayed behind the counter where only he could see it. Hannah thought about the photographs she had uncovered the previous afternoon. The smiling faces outside the saddle shop suddenly carried new meaning. "The people in those pictures weren't just customers," she said quietly. "They were neighbors he helped." "Exactly," Walt nodded. "Many of us would have lost our ranches without him." Hannah looked toward the rolling pasture stretching beyond the house. "I grew up here and never heard anyone tell those stories." Walt sighed. "Harper didn't believe good deeds should become advertisements. Most folks he helped stayed quiet because he asked them to." "Then how did everyone forget?" Walt remained silent for a moment. "Time has a way of burying ordinary heroes, especially the ones who never asked to be remembered." His answer lingered between them. Hannah understood more than she had before, yet the registry still raised countless questions. She carefully turned several more pages, tracing the neat handwriting. Some names appeared alone, others had 2 or 3 different symbols beside them. Whatever system Harper had used, it had been remarkably consistent. Then something caught her eye. Near the middle of the ledger, the page edges no longer lined up evenly. She slipped a finger between them. A single sheet had been removed cleanly from the binding, leaving only a narrow strip where it had once been sewn. "Walt," she said quietly, "look at this." He leaned closer. His expression darkened. "That page wasn't missing." "You're certain?" "I'm certain." He rested one hand on the cover. "I didn't remember every name in the book, but I remember it being complete." Hannah gently examined the torn edge. It had not fallen out with age. Someone had deliberately removed it. "Do you know what was written there?" Walt slowly shook his head. "No." Harper never let anyone read through the whole registry. We only saw our own entries if we happened to notice them. Hannah closed the ledger carefully. One mystery had finally been answered. The rancher's registry was not a ledger of debts, but a quiet record of generosity. Yet someone, at some point, had decided that one page no longer belonged inside it. She looked at the gap in the binding one last time, wondering whose names had disappeared with that missing sheet. Hannah drove back to town with the rancher's registry resting on the passenger seat. But Walt Mercer's words stayed with her far longer than the gravel road beneath her tires. The book was not a record of business. It was a record of quiet generosity. Every name represented someone who had been helped without humiliation, and every small symbol marked a different act of kindness instead of a debt. By the time she unlocked the front door of Harper's Saddle Shop, she no longer saw an abandoned building. She saw the place where countless neighbors had once found hope when they needed it most. The afternoon sun streamed through the front windows as she returned the ledger to the workbench. She decided not to hide it again. Instead, she laid it open beside the old photographs she had cleaned the day before. If Harper had taken such care preserving the stories of others, she could at least preserve the building where those stories began. She spent the next several hours clearing another section of shelves. Behind cracked boxes of rusted buckles, she discovered rows of leather patterns neatly rolled together and labeled in careful handwriting. Each pattern carried the name of a ranch family rather than a product number. Harper had apparently measured every horse individually. Even decades later, the organization inside the workshop reflected remarkable patience. Near sunset, Ellie Morgan stopped by after finishing her rounds. She carried a small paper sack. "I figured you forgot to eat," she said with a smile, handing Hannah a sandwich and a bottle of water. Hannah laughed softly. "You're probably right." Ellie noticed the open ledger. "Any luck figuring it out?" Hannah nodded. "I visited Walt Mercer this morning." Ellie's expression brightened. "He's one of the kindest men around." Hannah explained what Walt had shared, carefully describing how Harper had quietly repaired saddles, replaced equipment, and helped struggling ranchers without asking for payment. Ellie listened without interrupting when Hannah finished. She remained silent for a moment before saying, "That sounds exactly like the stories my grandfather used to tell." He never mentioned a registry, though. "Did he know Harper?" Hannah asked. "Only a little. He always said Harper measured success by how many people stayed on their land, not by how much money he made." Hannah looked around the shop. "It's strange that almost nobody remembers him that way now." Ellie nodded. "People remember scandals more easily than kindness." The words settled heavily between them. Hannah understood that truth all too well. After Ellie left, Hannah opened the registry again. She chose another name at random and searched through an old county map she had found in one of the drawers. The family still owned a ranch several miles east of town. The next morning she drove there. An elderly woman answered the door. Her name matched the registry exactly. At first she seemed cautious, but when Hannah explained where she had found the book, the woman's eyes filled with tears. "Harper fixed my husband's harness after a flood ruined everything," she said quietly. "We tried paying him over the next year. He refused every dollar." She smiled through the memory. "He only asked that we help someone else when we were able." Hannah thanked her before leaving. Throughout the following 2 days, she visited 3 more names,
Every story differed in detail, but carried the same heart. One rancher remembered receiving new stirrups after losing livestock to disease. Another family recalled Harper repairing every piece of worn tack before branding season, insisting they keep their savings for feed. A widow spoke of arriving at the shop ashamed that she could not pay. Harper had simply handed her the repaired saddle and wished her a safe ride home. None of them described him as a businessman first. They remembered him as a neighbor. Hannah returned each evening with new notes filling a small notebook of her own. The registry had become more than an old ledger. It had become a map leading from one forgotten story to another. Yet one question remained. If so many people had quietly benefited from Harper's generosity, why had his name almost disappeared from the town's memory? Late one afternoon, while sorting through another cabinet in the office, Hannah found a bundle of yellowed envelopes tied together with faded string. Most contained receipts for leather shipments or simple supply orders. One envelope, however, felt different. Inside rested a single folded letter written on thick stationery. The ink had faded, but the handwriting remained readable. She unfolded it carefully. The note was brief. If you are reading this, the registry has survived longer than I expected. It is only a book, but the promises inside it belong to this community. The registry must never disappear. There was no signature, only the familiar initials H.S. Hannah read the final sentence twice. Someone had intentionally written those words for whoever might one day find the ledger. She slipped the letter back into its envelope just as the sound of tires crunching across gravel reached the front of the shop. A dark pickup stopped outside. A well-dressed man stepped out, looking around the property before approaching the open doorway. "You must be Hannah Brooks," he said politely. "I'm Victor Hale." Hannah recognized the name immediately. Victor owned the largest agricultural supply company in the county. His stores served nearly every ranch for miles. He glanced around the old workshop with a measured expression. "I heard someone finally bought this place." "I did." "Then perhaps we can help each other." He removed a business card from his pocket. "I've been interested in this property for years. The building isn't practical anymore, but the land has value. I'd be willing to make you a fair offer." Hannah looked across the workshop. The cleaned photographs rested against the wall. Harper's tools remained where he had left them decades earlier. The registry and the letter lay on the workbench. Only a week earlier, she might have accepted almost any offer simply to escape the town. Now the idea felt different. "Thank you," she said calmly, "but I'm not selling." Victor studied her for a moment, surprised but not offended. "Think it over," he replied. "Old buildings have a way of becoming expensive burdens." "Maybe," Hannah answered, "or maybe some are worth more than they appear." Victor nodded politely before leaving without another argument. After his truck disappeared down the road, Hannah returned to the workbench and unfolded the letter once more. Her eyes settled again on the final line, now carrying even greater weight than before. The registry must never disappear. The letter remained on Hannah's workbench long after the afternoon light had faded. She read its final sentence again before carefully returning it to its envelope. The registry must never disappear. Those words no longer sounded like a simple request. They felt like a responsibility. The next morning, she carried the envelope, the rancher's registry, and her notebook to the county historical room inside the old courthouse. The archive occupied 2 quiet rooms filled with shelves of local newspapers, property records, photographs, and town directories. Dust floated through the shafts of sunlight pouring across old wooden tables. A volunteer pointed her toward the shelves containing business records from decades earlier. Hannah spent hours reading faded newspaper articles about Harper Saddle Shop. At first, the stories matched everything she had learned.
The shop sponsored livestock fairs. Harper repaired tack for rodeos. Ranchers praised the quality of his craftsmanship. Then the articles suddenly changed. One headline from many years earlier caught her attention. Local merchant accused of favoritism. She read every line carefully. The article claimed Harper had been giving expensive work away to selected ranchers while refusing to help others. Another paper published letters from angry residents accusing him of unfair treatment. A later edition announced declining business at the shop. A year after that came a short notice reporting that Harper's Saddle Shop had permanently closed. Hannah leaned back in her chair. None of the articles mentioned the registry. None mentioned quiet acts of generosity or promises to help others. They painted Harper as a businessman whose own choices had ruined his reputation. Yet the stories she had heard from Walt and the other ranch families described someone entirely different. She copied dates into her notebook before returning to the saddle shop. Ellie arrived shortly afterward, carrying a small box of cleaning cloths. "You look like you've been reading all day," she said. Hannah nodded. "I found old newspaper reports about Harper." She explained what she had discovered. Ellie frowned. "That doesn't sound like the man everyone described." "Exactly." Hannah placed the articles beside the registry. Either the newspapers missed the truth, or something happened that people never talked about afterward. Ellie carefully turned several pages of the registry. Every family you visited told nearly the same story, which makes these articles even harder to believe. Ellie looked around the workshop. Maybe the people who knew him best simply stayed quiet. Hannah sighed. Silence can change history faster than lies. Later that afternoon, she drove to the county clerk's office, hoping to find business filings connected to the shop. Most records had already been transferred into storage, but after nearly an hour of searching, a clerk returned carrying 2 worn document folders. The first contained property transfers and tax receipts. Nothing unusual appeared there. The second folder held several legal notices concerning Harper's Saddle Shop. Hannah carefully reviewed each page until she noticed a reference to supporting statements that were no longer attached. She searched the folder again. Empty staples remained where additional documents had once been fastened.
"Excuse me,"
she asked the clerk.
"are there supposed to be more papers with this file?"
The clerk examined the folder. "Looks like there should be. Do you know where they are?" He shook his head. "If they're not here, they were removed before the records came into storage. I couldn't tell you when." Hannah thanked him and returned the folders, unsettled by what she had found. This was now the second time important papers connected to Harper's story had disappeared. Back at the saddle shop, she spread everything across the workbench. The registry, the photographs, the letter, her notes from Walt and the other ranch families, newspaper clippings accusing Harper of favoritism, property records with missing attachments. None of the pieces fit together cleanly. Just before sunset, another truck stopped outside. Sheriff Daniel Ross stepped through the doorway, removing his hat politely. Hannah stiffened. During the weeks following the scandal, she had seen him more than anyone else connected with the investigation. Although he had never accused her directly, his questions had always reminded her that many people believed the worst. "Sheriff," she said cautiously. "Hope I'm not interrupting," he replied. His eyes wandered across the restored workbench and the old photographs. "Word gets around. Folks say you've been digging into Harper's Saddle Shop." Hannah nodded. "I'm trying to understand what really happened here." Daniel studied the newspaper copies lying on the table. "Harper's name doesn't come up much anymore. I've noticed." She hesitated before asking, "Do old sheriff's records still exist?" "Most of them. Would there be anything about the accusations against Harper?" Daniel considered the question. "Possibly. Cases that old are usually boxed away downstairs." Hannah looked hopeful. "Would you mind checking?" The sheriff nodded slowly. "I can take a look." He paused before adding, People assume records last forever. They don't. Things get misplaced. 2 days later, Daniel returned carrying a thin archival folder. "This is everything I could find," he said. Hannah opened it carefully. Inside were only a few reports summarizing complaints made against Harper. References throughout the file pointed toward witness statements and supporting evidence.
But none of those papers remained. The folder ended abruptly. "That's all?" Hannah asked quietly. Daniel looked disappointed. "There should be considerably more." He tapped one page where several attachments had been listed. "See these reference numbers? None of the attached documents are here." Hannah slowly closed the folder. "Someone removed them." Daniel did not answer immediately. Finally, he said, "I can't prove that, but they certainly weren't misplaced yesterday." Silence settled over the workshop. Hannah looked from the incomplete sheriff's file to the registry resting beside it. One preserved the memory of kindness. The other preserved only accusations. Between them lay an absence that could not be ignored. She carefully stacked the papers together, realizing that somewhere in the past, someone had deliberately ensured parts of Harper's story would no longer be available to anyone searching for the truth. The sheriff's folder remained open on the workbench long after Daniel Ross left the saddle shop. Hannah compared the incomplete reports with the rancher's registry and the notes she had gathered from ranch families over the past week. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The official records spoke only of complaints and accusations. The registry quietly documented years of generosity. Somewhere between those two versions of history, something important had been lost. The next morning, Ellie Morgan arrived carrying a notebook and a small basket of fresh muffins. "You look like you've slept about 3 hours," she said with a sympathetic smile. Hannah laughed softly. "That's probably generous." Ellie glanced at the papers spread across the workbench. "Still trying to make sense of the symbols?" Hannah nodded. "Walt explained one of them, but there are several others." Ellie pulled a chair beside the bench. "Let's see if the stories you've collected can help." Together, they opened the registry beside Hannah's notebook. Each interview she had conducted included details about the help Harper had given. As they compared names with symbols, small patterns slowly emerged. The mark Walt carried appeared only beside ranchers who had received entirely new saddles. Another symbol appeared beside nearly every family who had described free harness repairs. A third showed up beside those who had borrowed tools or leather until they could replace them. None of the symbols represented money. They represented different kinds of help. Hannah copied each pattern onto a fresh page. "He built his own language," she said quietly. Ellie smiled. "Not to hide anything, to organize kindness." By midday, they had identified several recurring marks with reasonable confidence. The registry was beginning to reveal its structure without losing its mystery. Every page reflected careful thought. Harper had remembered exactly what each family needed without recording a single unpaid balance. "I've never seen bookkeeping like this," Hannah admitted. "Because it isn't bookkeeping," Ellie replied. "It's a promise that someone mattered." Those words stayed with Hannah as they visited another ranch that afternoon. An elderly couple welcomed them onto their porch after Hannah explained why she had come. When she showed them the registry, the husband immediately recognized Harper's handwriting. "He repaired every strap on our wagon harness after a wildfire," he recalled. "We tried bringing him money after the cattle sale." His wife smiled warmly. "He told us to spend it fixing the barn instead." Hannah showed them the symbol beside their family name. They nodded immediately. "That's the repair mark," the husband said without hesitation. Hannah added another confirmation to her notebook. By the end of the day, the pattern had become unmistakable. Harper had created a private record not of what people owed him, but of how he had quietly helped them continue working. On the drive back to town,
Ellie looked out across the open fields. "Do you realize what this means?" she asked. Hannah nodded slowly. "Dozens of ranches survived because of one saddle shop. Probably more than dozens." Hannah remembered the long rows of names filling the registry. Every page represented another family, another difficult season, another chance to remain on land that might otherwise have been lost. The old building no longer seemed like a forgotten business. It had once been part of the community's foundation. Late the following afternoon, a familiar pickup stopped outside the shop. Victor Hale stepped out carrying a rolled property survey beneath one arm. His expression remained polite, just as it had during his first visit. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. Hannah set aside the notebook. "Not at all." Victor glanced around the workshop. The cleaned shelves, organized tools, and uncovered photographs made the room look noticeably different from his previous visit. "You've accomplished quite a bit already. There's still plenty to do." He nodded before unrolling the survey across the workbench. "I've been thinking about our conversation." Hannah folded her arms, already guessing what would follow. "The offer still stands," Victor said calmly. "In fact, I'm prepared to improve it." He named a figure far larger than the $75 she had paid only days earlier. Under different circumstances, the amount would have solved nearly every financial problem she faced. Hannah looked at the papers spread around the workshop. The registry, her notes, the photographs, Harper's letter. None of them had any obvious market value, yet together they felt priceless. "I appreciate the offer," she answered, "but I'm still not interested in selling." Victor studied her for a moment. "May I ask why?" Hannah considered the question carefully. "When I bought this place, I thought I was buying an abandoned building. Now I know I'm looking after something much larger." Victor remained silent. "People keep telling me the land is valuable," Hannah continued. "They're right, just not for the reason they think." He slowly rolled the survey closed again. "Old buildings cost money to maintain." "So do good memories," Hannah replied. Victor gave a thoughtful nod rather than arguing. "If you ever change your mind, you know where to find me." "Thank you." After he drove away, Ellie stepped out from the back room where she had been organizing tools. "You really surprised him." Hannah smiled faintly. "I surprised myself." Evening settled over the saddle shop. As sunlight faded through the front windows, Hannah opened the registry once more, turning pages that now carried meaning instead of mystery. New saddles, repairs, borrowed tools, quiet generosity. Then, almost absent-mindedly, her eyes drifted farther down one page. She stopped breathing for a moment. There, written in the same careful handwriting as every other entry, was a name she knew better than any other. Thomas Brooks, her father's name. Beside it appeared one of the symbols they had only just identified. Hannah stared at the page in stunned silence, realizing that long before she was born, Harper had quietly helped her own family too. Hannah remained frozen beside the workbench, her fingertips resting lightly on the edge of the open registry. Thomas Brooks. Her father's name stood neatly among hundreds of others, followed by the same symbol she and Ellie had identified as representing equipment provided without payment. She read the line again, hoping she had mistaken it for another Thomas Brooks, but there was no doubt. Her father had grown up on one of the oldest ranches outside town. There could be no one else. Ellie leaned closer. "That's your father, isn't it?" Hannah nodded slowly. "He never told me." The words came out almost as a whisper. She closed the registry carefully, unwilling to damage the fragile pages. Memories she had not revisited in years drifted back with surprising clarity. She remembered her father spending evenings repairing worn fences after long days in the fields. She remembered him stopping to help strangers whose trucks had broken down on lonely county roads.
She remembered him quietly leaving bags of feed on a neighbor's porch after a harsh winter, never signing his name. As a child, she had assumed he was simply generous.
Now she wondered where he had learned that habit. "He always said that someday we'd all need each other." Hannah murmured, "I thought it was just something parents say." Ellie smiled gently. "Maybe someone once said it to him." The possibility settled over them in silence. If Harper had helped Thomas Brooks when he was struggling, then the kindness recorded in the registry had not ended with one generation. It had continued through the people whose names filled its pages. Hannah spent the evening searching through the few family keepsakes she had stored in one of the cardboard boxes rescued from her old office. Most contained photographs, birthday cards, and newspaper clippings from school events. At the bottom, she found an old family picture taken outside the small farmhouse where she had grown up. Her father stood beside a chestnut horse wearing a saddle Hannah had never noticed before. She studied the image carefully. The craftsmanship looked remarkably similar to the saddle still resting on Harper's workbench. She turned the photograph over. Her mother's handwriting identified the year, but nothing else. No mention of Harper. No explanation. The next morning, Hannah drove to the abandoned Brooks Ranch. Her parents had both passed away several years earlier, and the property had been sold to another family. The new owners kindly allowed her to walk through the old equipment shed where a few unused items still remained. Most belonged to the current owners, but one corner held several weathered pieces they had never thrown away, because they assumed someone in the Brooks family might eventually want them. Hannah carefully sorted through worn buckets, broken tools, and cracked wooden crates. She found nothing connected to Harper. Yet, simply standing inside the familiar building brought back another memory. She remembered asking her father once why he always repaired old equipment instead of replacing it. He had smiled and answered, "Because someone repaired things for me before I could afford to do it myself." At the time, she had been too young to ask what he meant. Now, she finally understood. Back at the saddle shop, Ellie listened quietly as Hannah shared everything she had remembered. "Your father never talked about receiving help because that wasn't the point," Ellie said. "He repaid it by helping other people." Hannah looked toward the registry. "Then every name in that book probably has another story that was never written down." Ellie nodded. The second half of each story happened somewhere else. They spent the afternoon comparing Thomas Brooks's entry with the others surrounding it. The same symbol appeared beside several neighboring ranches from the same year. Hannah wondered whether a drought or difficult season had affected the entire valley. Whatever had happened, Harper had responded by helping multiple families at once. As daylight faded, Hannah carefully cleaned another section of the office behind the workshop. Dust coated every shelf. Old account books, supply catalogs, and leather scraps filled the cabinets. Behind a stack of warped wooden boxes, she noticed that one desk drawer refused to slide open completely. Assuming it had swollen with age, she gently pulled harder. Something inside blocked its movement. She reached through the narrow opening and felt a small metal latch that had fallen sideways. After lifting it free, the drawer finally opened all the way. Inside rested only a few ordinary items: dried ink bottles, worn pencils, and several blank order forms. Beneath them lay a small wooden box no larger than a recipe tin. Unlike everything else in the drawer, it was locked. There was no label, no decoration. Only smooth wood polished by time and a tiny brass keyhole in the center. Hannah lifted it carefully into the fading light. "Ellie," she called softly. Ellie walked over and looked at the box. "Have you seen a key that size?" Hannah slowly shook her head. "No." She turned the box over. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, as though papers or something equally dense rested inside. Neither woman tried forcing the lock.
After everything the shop had already revealed, impatience no longer felt appropriate. Hannah placed the box beside the registry on the workbench. Two objects rested there now, both preserved by someone who had believed the future would eventually place them in careful hands. She gently brushed a layer of dust from the lid, wondering how many years it had waited inside that forgotten drawer before finally being found. Morning arrived quietly at Harper's saddle shop. Hannah unlocked the front door before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops, the familiar scent of old leather greeting her as she stepped inside. The wooden box, the registry, and the bundle of letters still rested on the workbench exactly where she had left them the night before. She carefully unfolded one of the thank you notes again, reading the closing line that had stayed with her ever since discovering it. "One day we'll do for someone else what you did for us." She placed it beside the registry. Together, the two documents completed each other. One recorded Harper's actions, the other recorded the lives those actions had changed. Ellie arrived carrying fresh coffee and a folder filled with protective document sleeves. "I thought these might help," she said. "Those letters deserve better than an old wooden box." Hannah smiled gratefully. Together they spent the morning preserving every letter and receipt, numbering them so they would remain connected to the corresponding entries in the registry. As they worked, Hannah noticed that nearly every receipt carried a brief, handwritten remark. Some read, "Paid by Harper." Others simply said, "No charge." A few contained only one sentence. "Needed before winter." "Family lost cattle." "Harness beyond repair." None sounded like the language of business. Every note reflected a decision to help someone at precisely the moment they needed it most. Ellie compared the receipts with the symbols they had already identified inside the registry. "This one matches the repair mark," she said, pointing to a receipt for leather straps. "And this one lines up with the symbol Walt recognized for a complete saddle." Hannah added each confirmation to her notebook. The private system Harper had created now made perfect sense. Instead of recording debts, he recorded burdens he had quietly lifted from other people. The registry was never meant to collect payment. It existed so no act of kindness would be forgotten, even if nobody else ever knew it had happened. Shortly before noon, Sheriff Daniel Ross stopped by carrying another folder beneath his arm. He greeted both women before laying the documents carefully across the workbench. "I've continued reviewing the records connected to your case," he said. Hannah's expression tightened despite herself. Daniel noticed immediately. "I'm not here to question you," he said gently. "Quite the opposite." He opened the folder and revealed copies of accounting summaries Hannah had already seen during the investigation. Beside them, he placed several index sheets listing supporting documents that should have accompanied those summaries. Every one of these references invoices, authorization forms, or bank reconciliations, he explained. None of those records are currently in the file. Hannah studied the paperwork. The references were unmistakable. Each missing document had been assigned a tracking number, proving it had once existed. Without them, the summaries looked incomplete and suspicious. "It's exactly what happened with Harper's records," she said quietly. Daniel nodded. "That's why I kept digging." He pointed toward one page. Someone reviewing only these summaries could easily reach the wrong conclusion. Hannah remembered standing before the town council while people judged her before the investigation had even finished. She suddenly saw the same pattern repeating across generations. Harper had been reduced to accusations because supporting records disappeared. She had experienced the same thing. Daniel closed the folder. "I still don't know where the missing files went," he admitted. "But I know they should be there." It was the first time anyone connected with the investigation had openly acknowledged that the official record itself might be incomplete. After he left, Hannah sat quietly for several minutes. Ellie finally broke the silence. Do you realize what keeps happening? Hannah nodded. Incomplete records create complete judgments.
Neither woman spoke again for a while. Instead, they returned to organizing the letters. One by one, they matched them to names inside the registry. The stories fit together naturally. A receipt explained a symbol. A thank you note explained a receipt. An interview with a ranch family confirmed both. The more evidence they assembled, the more impossible it became to believe Harper had ever acted out of favoritism. Late that afternoon, Hannah received a telephone call from Walt Mercer. His voice sounded thoughtful but hopeful. I spoke with the man I mentioned, Walt said. He agreed to meet. Hannah straightened. He's willing to talk? Yes. He told me he's tired of carrying old memories by himself. Does he know about the registry? He does now. I told him you found it, along with Harper's letters. Walt paused before continuing. He said if those survived, then perhaps it's finally time for the rest of the story to be heard. Hannah thanked him and carefully wrote down the meeting time. After ending the call, she looked around the workshop. The shelves were cleaner than when she first arrived. Harper's tools had been organized. The photographs now rested safely inside protective sleeves. The registry lay open beside the letters, no longer hidden in a locked drawer, but finally beginning to speak again through the people whose lives it had quietly touched. As the evening light stretched across the worn wooden floor, Hannah closed the registry with gentle hands. Tomorrow they would meet someone who had stood beside Harper during his final years. For the first time since opening the forgotten drawer beneath the old workbench, someone who had witnessed the truth firsthand was ready to tell what he remembered. The following morning, Hannah and Ellie drove together to a modest ranch on the far side of the county, where Walt Mercer had arranged the meeting. The house sat beneath a row of aging cottonwood trees, its porch shaded against the bright morning sun. Walt greeted them at the gate, his expression serious but hopeful. Thank you for coming, he said. He's inside. Hannah carried the rancher's registry beneath her arm, along with copies of the letters and receipts they had preserved. As they stepped into the sitting room, an elderly man slowly rose from a wooden chair. His name was Samuel Briggs. His back had bent with age, but his eyes remained clear. He looked first at the registry before looking at Hannah. I never thought I'd see that book again, he said quietly. Hannah placed it gently on the table between them. Walt told me you worked with Harper. Samuel nodded. During his last few years, he rested one hand on the leather cover without opening it. He wasn't only a saddle maker. He believed a ranch could disappear over something as small as a broken harness or a worn saddle if the wrong season arrived. Hannah listened without interrupting. Samuel continued slowly, choosing every word with care. People began talking when they noticed some families weren't paying immediately. They assumed Harper played favorites because they didn't know what was happening behind the counter. He looked toward Walt. Harper never defended himself, he said, explaining another person's hardship would only embarrass them. Ellie quietly unfolded several of the thank you letters. Samuel smiled as he recognized the handwriting. Those are the voices that mattered, he said. Not the rumors? Hannah asked softly. Did the accusations force him to close the shop? Samuel lowered his eyes. Business became harder. Fewer paying customers came. Suppliers grew nervous. Harper accepted it because he refused to reveal why he had helped people. He looked directly at Hannah. He protected their dignity even when it cost him his own reputation. Silence filled the room. Hannah realized she had been carrying the weight of public judgment in exactly the opposite way. She had spent weeks desperately trying to defend herself because she believed silence meant surrender. Harper had accepted misunderstanding rather than expose the private struggles of others. Samuel carefully opened the registry and turned several familiar pages.
The missing page troubled him, he admitted. Hannah leaned forward. Do you know who removed it? Samuel slowly shook his head. No, it disappeared after the shop closed. By then the building had changed hands several times. The answer brought no new mystery, only confirmation that the page had vanished after Harper's work ended. Samuel then reached into a worn envelope resting beside his chair. I almost forgot these. Inside were 2 faded copies of supply invoices bearing Harper's signature. Hannah immediately recognized the format. They matched the receipts found inside the locked box. Each invoice showed Harper personally paying wholesalers for materials later provided without charge to struggling ranchers. You kept these all these years? Hannah asked. Samuel smiled gently. Harper told me paperwork sometimes outlives memory. Hannah carefully compared the invoices with the registry. One matched Walt Mercer's entry. Another matched a widow whose letter they had already preserved. The records fit perfectly. They did not change the story, they confirmed it. On the drive back to town, Hannah remained unusually quiet. Ellie finally asked, What are you thinking? Hannah looked out across the passing fields. Every piece fits now. The registry, the letters, the receipts, the interviews, Samuel's memories. None of them contradict each other. Ellie nodded. The truth survived because enough ordinary people remembered it. That afternoon, Sheriff Daniel Ross arrived at the saddle shop carrying a sealed document envelope. His expression was noticeably different from previous visits. We found them, he said simply. Hannah looked at him in disbelief. Daniel placed several original accounting documents across the workbench. They were the missing reconciliation reports from the Community Harvest Fund investigation. Each transaction Hannah had been accused of mishandling was fully documented with matching approvals, receipts, and bank confirmations. The apparent discrepancies disappeared once the complete records were restored. Daniel exhaled slowly. The missing documents had been misfiled inside another archive box during document transfers years ago. They weren't destroyed. They were simply never reviewed. Hannah closed her eyes for a brief moment. Weeks of humiliation, whispered conversations, and broken trust suddenly felt painfully unnecessary. Daniel continued. The investigation will officially reflect the complete file. These records support everything you've maintained from the beginning. Hannah looked at the papers but said nothing. Relief arrived quietly rather than dramatically. It did not erase what had happened, but it finally allowed the truth to stand beside the accusations. News traveled quickly through the small town. Within days, several former clients visited the saddle shop. Some apologized awkwardly. Others admitted they had believed the rumors too quickly. Hannah accepted every apology with kindness, never asking anyone to justify their earlier doubts. Later that week, Victor Hale returned once more. He removed his hat before entering the workshop, his expression thoughtful. I owe you an apology, he said. Hannah looked up from organizing the registry. Victor continued. I believed the stories I'd always heard about Harper. I assumed this building represented a failed business. He glanced around the restored workshop. I was wrong. Hannah smiled faintly. Most people only knew part of the story. Victor nodded. If there's anything my company can contribute toward preserving the shop, I'd like to help. Hannah thanked him sincerely. She recognized that his change of heart mattered more than another purchase offer ever could. That evening, after everyone had left, Hannah sat alone beside the workbench. The registry rested open before her. Nearly every question that had brought her into the abandoned saddle shop now had an answer. Harper's purpose was understood. Her own name had been cleared. The community was beginning to remember what had been forgotten. As she slowly turned toward the final pages of the registry, she noticed one section she had deliberately left unread from the beginning. Carefully, Almost reverently, she placed her fingers beneath the final unopened page and prepared to discover Harper's last written words.
Hannah stood alone in the quiet workshop as evening settled outside the windows of Harper's saddle shop. The rancher's registry rested open before her, its final pages waiting. She drew a slow breath and carefully turned the last unopened sheet. Instead of another list of names or symbols, she found a handwritten letter covering the entire page. The familiar, steady handwriting left no doubt that Harper himself had written it. Ellie, who had been arranging the preserved letters nearby, quietly stepped beside her. Hannah began to read aloud. "If these pages have found their way into your hands, then someone cared enough to keep looking after the shop when I no longer could." She paused before continuing. "You may have heard many stories about me. Some will say I was foolish. Others will remember only the complaints that came during my final years. Every town eventually chooses the stories it repeats. I cannot decide which stories survive." Hannah's voice softened as she continued reading. "What I can decide is how I treated the people who walked through this door. I never believed hardship should become public simply because someone needed help. A broken saddle, a damaged harness, or an empty feed account may seem like ordinary problems, but sometimes they stand between a family and losing everything they have built. If I asked for nothing in return, it was because dignity is worth protecting." Ellie lowered her eyes as Hannah continued.
This registry was never meant to record debts. It records opportunities. Every name reminds me that when one neighbor is lifted, the entire community stands a little stronger. If you have found this book, I ask only one thing. Do not remember me. Remember what these people chose to do after receiving kindness. If they helped someone else,
Then every sacrifice made inside this workshop was worthwhile. Hannah reached the final lines. Buildings wear out. Leather cracks. Wood rots. Even names are forgotten, but mercy has a strange way of traveling farther than the hands that first offered it. If that remains true after I am gone, then this shop never truly closed." At the bottom appeared only two simple initials, H.S. Hannah gently closed the registry. The mystery that had begun with a locked drawer beneath an abandoned workbench had reached its conclusion without hidden treasure or secret fortune. Harper's greatest legacy had never been the shop itself. It had been the quiet chain of generosity carried from one family to another, year after year, without expectation of praise. Ellie smiled through tearful eyes. "Now we know why he protected everyone's privacy." Hannah nodded. "He believed kindness mattered more than credit." During the weeks that followed, the saddle shop slowly welcomed visitors once again. Ranch families arrived carrying photographs, worn pieces of tack, faded receipts, and memories they had nearly forgotten. Walt Mercer brought the saddle Harper had built for him decades earlier. Samuel Briggs spent afternoons answering questions from younger ranchers who had known only rumors about the old shop. The elderly couple whose wildfire story Hannah had recorded donated copies of family photographs to accompany their letter. Every contribution matched what the registry already revealed. None sought to make Harper larger than life. Instead, each story confirmed that an ordinary craftsman had quietly changed lives one decision at a time. Sheriff Daniel Ross visited carrying the official notice clearing Hannah's name. The corrected financial records had completed the investigation exactly as the recovered documents showed. The accusations against her were formally withdrawn. Daniel handed her the notice without ceremony. "The record finally reflects the truth," he said. Hannah accepted it with gratitude. "Thank you for continuing to look." He smiled gently. Harper's story reminded me that incomplete files rarely tell complete truths. Local newspapers eventually printed short corrections. Several people who had doubted Hannah came to apologize. Former clients returned. Some admitted they had believed the first accusation they heard because it seemed easier than waiting for answers. Hannah welcomed every apology with quiet grace. She had spent enough time learning how quickly judgment could grow from missing pieces. She refused to let bitterness become another inheritance. Victor Hale also returned. This time he carried no property survey and made no offer to purchase the building. Instead, he arrived with lumber, glass, and a carpenter from his company. "I'd like to help restore the front display," he said. "No business arrangement, just respect." Hannah accepted. Over the following days, volunteers from across the county repaired shelves, refinished display cases, and cleaned windows clouded by decades of dust. Ellie organized copies of the registry, the letters, the receipts, and the photographs into simple exhibits explaining how they connected. The original documents remained safely protected. While visitors could study faithful reproductions, nothing inside the restored shop exaggerated Harper's accomplishments. The displays simply allowed the evidence to speak for itself. One quiet afternoon, Hannah drove to the cemetery carrying the old family photograph she had found after discovering her father's name inside the registry. She stood beside her parents' graves and looked at her father smiling beside the saddle Harper had once built. At last, she understood why he had always stopped to help neighbors without expecting recognition. Someone had done the same for him when he needed it most. Harper's generosity had reached far beyond his own lifetime through people like Thomas Brooks, who continued the pattern without ever telling anyone where it began. Hannah smiled softly. "Thank you," she whispered, unsure whether she was speaking to her father, to Harper, or to both. As autumn settled over the valley, Harper's saddle shop quietly reopened. There were no banners or speeches. Neighbors simply gathered, shared stories, and walked through the restored workshop together. Children studied the old saddles while grandparents pointed toward familiar names inside the reproduced registry. Some visitors recognized relatives whose acts of kindness had never before been written into family history. Others simply left thoughtful and grateful. Before locking the shop that evening, Hannah placed the original registry Harper's final letter, the preserved receipts, and the collection of thank you notes into the restored cabinet beneath the old workbench where the story had begun. She added one final document of her own, explaining how the records had been discovered, how the missing pieces had been reunited, and how the community had helped preserve them. She signed only her name, Hannah Brooks. Then she gently closed the cabinet and turned off the lights. Standing outside, she looked once more at the weathered sign above the entrance. Weeks earlier, she had purchased the abandoned building for $75 because it was the only future she could still afford. She now realized she had never truly bought a saddle shop. She had been entrusted with a legacy that could not be measured in money. As she walked toward her truck beneath the fading evening sky, she knew Harper had been right. Buildings could be forgotten. Reputations could be damaged. Records could disappear. Yet one quiet act of compassion, remembered and passed from one person to another, could outlive them all. In the end, Hannah discovered that the greatest inheritance is rarely money, land, or possessions. It is the kindness we leave behind in the lives of others. Harper's quiet generosity survived long after his reputation had been damaged because the people he helped chose to pass that compassion forward instead of keeping it for themselves. The story reminds us that public opinion can be wrong. Incomplete evidence can destroy good names, and truth sometimes takes time to emerge. But it also teaches that integrity does not depend on recognition. Every unseen act of honesty, mercy, and selflessness has the power to shape future generations in ways we may never witness. Long after buildings fade and names are forgotten,
The good we do for others remains our most enduring legacy.